Hello, I'm Henry Mack. A new survey conducted by the Pew Research Center discusses the changing face of the American Jew. Among many shifts, an increase of Jews now describe themselves as having no religion, and the majority of those who do describe themselves as religiously Jewish claim that being Jewish is mostly a matter of culture, and believing in God is not necessary for identifying as a Jew. Is this change in Jewish identity a reflection of the growing secularism in America? Joining me to discuss the changing face of the Jewish life in America are Ira Sheskin, Director of the Jewish Demography Project of the Sue and Leonard Miller Center for Contemporary Judaic Studies at the University of Miami, Rabbi Jaime Aklepi, Rabbi at Bet Breira Samuel or Olam Temple in Miami, Tudor Parfit, Distinguished Professor and Navon Professor of Sephardi and Mizrahi Studies at Florida International University, and Henry Green, Professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Miami. Welcome all to the program, and thank you for joining. Yes, I was wondering if Ira, you can begin by sort of contextualizing this Pew study, describing it, talking about the details, so the viewers can sort of better understand the approach or the context for today's roundtable discussion.
Okay.
On this most fascinating topic.
Well, first, the Pew Research Center is one of the top research operations in the United States. And they've done quite a bit of research on religious groups, both in the United States as well as around the world. In this case, they did 3,500 interviews, and they were all done using a procedure called random digit dialing, which is state-of-the-art. Okay? They were not calling known Jewish households for this. They were simply dialing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of phone numbers and asking a series of questions to find out if anyone in the household was Jewish. If someone was, they continued with the survey. That's how they made their population estimate, and that's how they got through to people who will say they're Jewish, even though they don't belong to synagogues and they're not giving to Jewish organizations, and their last name is Miller and not Levine or Cohen. So this is done with the best possible procedures. It had a major budget behind it. It's the first such study in about 12 years.
What's the bottom line? Is this good? Is it bad?
Yes,
for
it's
Jews?
both.
It's
both. Here's one of the things we found out. Good news. The last two national Jewish population surveys put the number of Jews at 5.2 million in 1990 and at 5.5 million in the year 2000. Okay, I said both of those numbers, and I was part of those studies, were too low. We now have three estimates for 2013 of the number of Jews in the United States. This came out with 6.7 million. Brandeis University does studies of American Jews using a completely different methodology, and they come up with 6.8 million. And I am now the editor of the American Jewish Yearbook. We do our own estimate of the number of Jews, and we come up with 6.7 million. Mm-hmm. So we have three studies using three different procedures, all coming up with well over 1 million more Jews in this country than we thought we had. In addition, 94% of Jews say they're proud to be Jewish. And the intermarriage rate, which had been increasing significantly really since the 1970s, appears to have remained approximately the same since 1995. So there's some good news here. You can look at it on the other hand and say exactly what you said in the introduction. We have a large percentage of Jews today who view themselves basically as secular, about 22%. Mm-hmm. Yet 20% of Americans are secular.
Sure.
So Jews are becoming like everybody else.
So are sort of, I guess, the Jewish population sort of, yes, mirroring the American sort of ethos here, a culture that is increasingly sort of eschewing religious identity or religious affiliation. Rabbi, how do you see this report playing out, especially with someone who comes in direct contact on a daily basis with your congregation?
Well, there's a recent management book that says oy vey is not a strategy, and I think that's how I respond to this report. I think that it's not a question of gaining Jews or losing Jews. It's the kind of Jewish life that people are going to choose for themselves. America was this great frontier for the Jewish people because you didn't have to be Jewish. You could be an American, and that has developed over the years. And even with all of that great pull towards a secularization and a great pull to being part of the majority, there are still people who find great meaning in a Jewish life and what Judaism has to offer them. And I don't think that is decreasing. I think it may be shifting, and our goal is to help people find where in that spectrum of Judaism, where in the spectrum of our tradition, our values, our heritage, our practices will be a place for them. And it's not the same for everybody, and it's always moving, and it always has moved.
It seems, though, a little bit alarming, at least from the initial read of it. Professor Parfit, how do you read sort of this shift, or rather, what really does it mean to be a Jew in America today in light of sort of this study?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm the best person to ask. I'm A, not Jewish, B, I'm not American, and I've only been here for a year at FIU. So I think I'd have to answer a quite different question, which I will proceed to do.
Go for it.
Which is, looking at American society overall, one of the very interesting things is that, A, it's very religious compared, let's say, with Europe. Say 20% secular, that's much, much lower than it would be in England or France or most other European countries. And the second thing in the United States, which I find quite fascinating, is the fact that there's a much, much greater tendency here to change religions. So something like 50% of all Americans no longer practice the religion, if they're religious, no longer practice the religion that they were born into. Now that is completely novel in the history of the world. So here we have a kind of postmodern society where religions can be adopted in very much the same way that clothes can be changed according to fashions, and so you've got a kind of designer religious kind of phenomenon happening here, that you just choose what's good for you. And one of the things that comes out of the report is that there's an increasing number of, certainly there's an increasing number of converts in Judaism, and this may form part of this wider pattern of people changing religions. And of course the definition, and this is a very, very complex matter, which should not be left to Jews, in my view, of who is a Jew. And that's something that I'm sure we'll be talking about.
Yeah, I guess that's what I want to sort of touch on. What is the meaning of being a Jew in America today in light of this report? It is a fascinating phenomenon, at least in America, that there are these sort of shifts, and we are sort of a pick and choose culture. And that's interesting to see how that plays out in religious life, especially from this perspective. Professor Green, I was wondering if you could maybe help us grapple with these concepts.
Well, I think one way of looking at it is just not in terms of America. I think it's helpful to look at it in terms of Jewish civilization. And so when was there last a Jewish state? When was there last modernity, as it were, when Hellenism and Judaism came together? And if you look at Egypt, for example, which was the New York of the day, Alexandria, you have people like Sabbathians who were Sabbath believers, but not Jews. You had kinds of rituals. For example, someone like Philo would say, how come we don't get 10 people on a Saturday service on a Shabbat, but it's a full house for Yom Kippur. So from a comparative perspective, America is going through the same challenge of modernity. And when you look at the study and you look at it from, say, 3 generations, from 48 to 67, 67 to say, 90s or 80 to today, what you see is a very big shift in terms of response to Israel. And I think that one of the things the study didn't really focus on to some degree was that Israel plays a very, very strong sense in what Jewish identity means. And there's a difference generationally, and it's a big difference in terms of how people identify in terms of their Jewishness.
To what extent does foreign policy then sort of affect Jewish identity in this report? Are people more motivated or less motivated? I mean, to what extent sort of does the state of Israel and our interests abroad affect identification?
Well, in fact, and I need to disagree a little bit with Henry on this, if you went back and you looked at surveys from the 1950s, in the 1950s, younger people were less attached to Israel than older people are. This study shows that younger people are less attached to Israel than older people are. which means that as people age, they get more attached to Israel. And in fact, 43% of the respondents to this survey said that caring about Israel is an essential part of their being Jewish. Now that compares, the number for remembering the Holocaust is I think somewhere in the 70s. And the 43% that caring about Israel is tied to having a good sense of humor is an essential part of caring about Israel. But the fact of the matter is that Jews don't even vote in this country, for the most part, on the basis of U.S. foreign policy or on the basis of Israel. As long as both candidates have a somewhat acceptable point of view on Israel. So in the last election, Obama would have been viewed as, by the Israeli left as considerably more positive than McCain was. But both of them had points of view about the Arab-Israeli situation that fit within the mainstream of Israeli society, in which case American Jews are voting on the same economic and social issues that the rest of Americans are voting on.
I guess I'm still wondering, the biggest part that alarmed me is the relationship between culture and religion for the American Jew. And why does it seem, unless this is a complete misreading, that Jewish Americans are happy being culturally Jewish, but not at all in any way sort of being religiously Jewish? And the extent to which a lot of them don't even believe in God or think that God is a necessary precondition for Jewish identity.
God is not a necessary precondition for Jewish identity, and it has always been that way. Judaism operates on a system of obligations, mitzvot. So people who are people of faith and believe in God will believe that this system is inspired by God or written by God. Those people who don't believe that may still ascribe to many of those values and ideals in that mitzvah system, but they just don't feel that it is necessarily divine. Jews have always been a strong part of culture. As soon as they were able to move out of a ghetto, we've been able to adapt and bring in and assimilate all kinds of culture. So I think reading that report, and when I read it and discuss it with other Jewish professionals, when we see the Jewish by religion and the Jewish by culture only, I just smile because I'm not sure, I understand what it means, but when I see people day to day, I think those lines are not as clearly drawn in the sand as it would look like on a report. When you answer a question on the telephone, you answer it and you're put into this category. But as everything in life and everything in religion and culture, there's much more flexibility. So today, I won't do anything religious, maybe a person would say, but in 2 weeks it's Hanukkah and I'll go to a Hanukkah celebration. So now where am I in that survey?
I would have to tell you, as someone who's not only directed a lot of these studies, but I do some of the more difficult interviews myself in every study, and I agree with you on this. Somebody who will say their religion isn't Jewish on a Tuesday, next Thursday, all of a sudden, if they got the same questionnaire, they'd say their religion is Jewish. People who might answer on a Monday that they're not raising their children Jewish, then following Wednesday, same survey, they give you a different answer. It's a very fluid thing. When I was young, you were either Jewish or you weren't Jewish. Things were easy.
Yeah.
Now there's a lot of grayness there.
I guess as born and raised Catholic, I see the fluidity as inconsistency. And
fluidity is our strength.
Right.
The fluidity is the beautiful part.
Which I think is a distinction that's often missed. And I think your point is well taken on this score. Professor Parfit, I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on this fluidity and whether or not these distinctions are legitimate.
Well, I mean, there are so many things to say. The idea of Jewish, a sort of secular Jewish culture is one that's been around for a very, very long time. So that's perfectly legitimate. But in a sense, it's irrelevant. The real thing, I think, for Judaism, for the most part, over a couple of thousand years, has been ethnic identity rather than religious identity. I wouldn't even say that you could call Judaism a religion in many respects. It is a kind of religion, but it's not a religion like Catholicism. It's not a particularly spiritual tradition. And this indeed is one of the reasons that there are so many Jews who abandon the Jewish faith and take up things like Buddhism, you know, which are very spiritual. There's a sense that Judaism doesn't quite provide this spiritual thing. So it's largely ethnic, and that could just about be translated into saying that it's genetic. And I've done a lot of work on genetics. Now, a couple of very interesting things come out of this. So, according to the classical definition of who is a Jew is somebody who's got a Jewish mother, right? And if you've got a Jewish mother, you don't need to do anything else. You're always going to be a Jew from the standpoint of any kind of Jewish definition. But the genetics teach us that even though most Jewish populations throughout the world descend from an ancient Jewish population that lived at the eastern end of the Mediterranean thousands of years ago. And so the genetic profile is exactly the same, or very, very similar to Palestinians, to Druze, and to various other groups in eastern Cyprus and elsewhere, Levantine populations. However, Jewish women are quite a different matter, and Jewish women do not have the same genetic profile as Jewish men. And so therefore, if the real definition of who is a Jew depends upon the matrilineal descent, there are no Jews in the world,
right.
Which is turning the thing on its head a bit. And it's also intriguing that in none of the rabbinic work that was done, you know, in Talmudic times and later, is there any reference to the fact that all of the women in the various scattered communities outside Palestine were actually converts.
Right, right. Professor Green, I was wondering if you could expound upon that, the relationship that Professor Parfit is talking about between genetics and self-identity, and you know, sort of how that affects then our contemporary understanding of what it means to be a Jew today. I'm still sort of conflicted and really sort of confused how it seems to be inherently the case that Judaism is less about religion and religious worship and more about cultural, ethnic identification in this respect.
The historical experience of Judaism is that it is connected to a community. And the community is very much part of the vibrancy that creates the continuity. So it's, and if you look at Jewish ritual frequently involves that you need 10 people to pray or 10 people to do certain kinds of things. And the community becomes the wheel, as it were, that drives it. And for Jews then, the definition of who is a Jew very much depends on what community you're part of. There's a comment in the Talmud that your community is defined by the fence you put around it. So you could be an Orthodox, you could be Reform, and within that, if you start looking at different kinds of behaviors, for example, you would see, I think I would agree with this, that when it comes to Passover Seders or lighting Hanukkah candles, it cuts across everyone. It's very, very high. But if you want to keep kosher, it drops off dramatically. So as secularization moves along, you adapt different things in the culture that then gives you an identity that touches this Jewish wheel, as it were, that moves forward, and you're adapting to secularization. But on the other hand, you're also saying, I'm a Jew. And you've redefined it to meet the era that you live in.
And I think I disagree with you. I don't think that Judaism is removing itself from its religious aspects or worship aspects. I think the lines that we are creating don't seem to fit the Jewish people and the Jewish civilization. We are moving in and out. It's as we said, it's fluid. I think that people are very much connected to a sense of spirituality, a sense of searching for the divine. As Ira said, on a Monday, and Thursday they may not. And I think that's human nature. Human nature is going to hopefully search for a community, search for a way to highlight the important aspects of their lives, important milestones of their lives, and that's what religion does. And humanity looks for a way to refine and raise itself. Also the place of religion, and in this case, it's Judaism. So, and within Judaism, or we should maybe say Judaisms, because it's such a broad group of people and a broad practice of ideas, within that framework, we can enhance ourselves, refine ourselves, become better people. And it's not the same route, and it's not always through an ancient text, and it's not always through a ritual in the synagogue. So much of Judaism, so much of religious life in Judaism is practiced in the home. So we are broader and fluid and much more flexible, and I think the funny part of the survey, in addition to humor being so much of an aspect of defining oneself as Jewish, is to put us in a survey like that. I think what we want to learn from the survey is who is out there and what they're thinking. And can we know better what a Jewish person your age is thinking, and an older Jewish person is thinking, and a person that's just a peripheral Jewish, or somebody who's not Jewish but likes hanging with Jews, and how do we bring them in, and how do we make them a part, and how do we make what we do important?
Sure.
I think the business of humour is silly. I really do think it's silly.
It is silly.
And it's very kind of...
It's funny.
It's kind of funny, but in a way it's not kind of funny, because it's really centred on the European experience. So, you know, from Yiddish-speaking Jews, from the Städtlach of Eastern Europe, the idea of a certain kind of Jewish humour became a kind of way of self-defining. But this isn't true of the Sephardi communities. It's not true of the Yemenites particularly. It's not true of the Ethiopian Jews. They don't have this kind of self-deprecating humour. And, you know, a kind of... it's a kind of self-consciousness,
but only,
you know, which they don't have.
Right.
So I don't particularly see that as very helpful. I mean, I think that one of the things that's not been discussed, and you can't really talk about Jews or Jewish identity or Jewish anything without talking, or at least reflecting upon the Holocaust. And I was very, very moved in a way, in a sense, by reading something recently about committees that were set up in Jerusalem in 1946, 1947, which were called Committees of the Lost Tribes, Nidche Israel, the kind of lost people of Israel. And so the idea of this was that we've just lost 6 million people, probably more, 7 million in fact, during the Second World War. 7 million Jews were killed during the Second World War. And there was a kind of sense that these people had to be replenished. And a lot of my work has been involved with looking at different groups throughout the world who feel drawn towards Judaism. A lot of them are in the United States. I've just published a book on black Jews in the United States, who are very numerous. By and large, they're excluded from the status of Jew by Jews, because they're not, according to Jewish law, halakha, Jewish. They don't have a Jewish mother according to them. And at this point, I kind of, step in and say, I mean, this isn't entirely a Jewish matter. The question of definition is one that has to be done by, I won't say experts, because that's a very dirty term, but let me just make this point. It's a phenomenological issue. If people do certain things from the perspective of somebody interested in religion, if they do certain things, you have to give them a tag, a name.
Right.
And that may be Jewish, even if all Jews in the world say, they're not Jewish.
And that sort of raises these interesting questions about identification and really how to classify and sort of what that means for the future.
Except that the Pew survey did exactly what Tudor wants it to do. And that is, it basically asked if you consider yourself to be Jewish. And you could say yes, even though the Orthodox might not consider you to be Jewish. And in fact, about 5% of American Jews are non-white. And so we did the survey as the NJPS 2000, the National Jewish Population Survey done in 2000, picked up the appropriate number of Jews. And the survey respondents agree that remembering the Holocaust is very important. In fact, in a question, what does it mean to be Jewish? What's an essential part of being Jewish? 73% said the Holocaust. That leads about 9 factors they asked about. Okay, caring about Israel was down at 43%, having a good sense of humor was at 42%. Leading an ethical and moral life was second at 69%.
Which goes back to your question, you don't have to believe in God to be
Sure.
Jewish.
And
That's the
observing
answer.
Jewish laws in there at 19%. So most American Jews do not see following Jewish law as an essential part of being Jewish.
It seems confusing to do so absent a divine lawgiver in this respect. I mean, this notion of self-identification, self-determination amongst the Jewish culture, absent a formal belief in a deity, is just fascinating and sort of mind-blowing to me. But last word, do you think this Pew study is an accurate representation? Really quick.
Yes, I think it's an accurate representation, and it has both positive and negative things to say about the future of American Jews.
Rabbi?
Absolutely. I think it's accurate, and I think we have to look at it and do some good thinking about where we go from here and how do we include those people who are not sure they want to be included yet.
Great. Fascinating study. I think everybody should have definitely a look at it to learn exactly what we're sort of trying to understand here. We're out of time for today's program, and I'd like to thank all of our guests. Thank you very much for joining us. Visit our website at wpbt2.org/viewpoint and post your comments on today's program. We would very much like to hear your thoughts. Join us for another episode of Viewpoint Sunday, December 15th and Sunday, December 29th at our new time, 12:30 p.m. I'm Henry Mack, and thank you for watching.